title has already been given for us. Again, apologies from Professor Watt, the current holder of the Kersler Chair. I know she wanted to be here. This study was conducted by her, and the experimenters in it were 3 of the co-authors who are final year students, and they used this work for their dissertation at Edinburgh, and that was Emily Dawson, Abby Pooley, and Holly Rice. And Alistair Tullow was the one that did the programming for the experiment. Now let me see if I can get this to work. Yes. The subtitle is Don't Give Up on Us, Baby. I have been reliably informed by Caroline that this comes from a song that someone called David Soul did in 1976. I'm not familiar with it personally, but the idea behind it is that these days among researchers, there's a very big move, as you've been hearing, towards using unconscious measures of psi in your experimental work. And experimentation goes through different stages. And we went in the 60s from the forced choice Zener card type methodologies into the free response methodologies, the dream research, and then the Ganzfeld that developed out of the dream research, and so on. And this is a plea that there might still be a lot of mileage, and as we've been hearing earlier today, I think it's evident there is a lot of mileage to be gained from retaining free response methodologies. And so that's the Don't Give Up on Us, Baby refers to that aspect of it. Is anyone here unfamiliar with the Ganzfeld? Please be honest, because I'll either skip over it very quickly. Not, okay. Let me know if you need more information. I know Ganzfeld work has been presented at this conference since the mid-70s. One of the first of 3 researchers working independently to use and adapt the method to parapsychology was Adrian Parker. He did this along with William Broad and Charles Honorton, who was the first into print, but they were all working independently, so it was obviously an idea whose time had come. It was viewed in many ways as a concise way of testing for using a free response methodology in an altered state that was thought to mimic the hypnagogic state, which is the state you're in just before you fall asleep, which is characterized by a lot of fleeting imagery. The hope being that the fleeting imagery might relate to the target that someone would be trying to convey to them typically. Now, there are 2 main stages in the Ganzfeld method. The first is the participant will make a report ongoing of their verbal images during the time that they are receiving the Ganzfeld stimulation. The second stage is that the impressions that they've received are judged, usually by the participant, against 4 randomly chosen possible targets, one of which, again, was randomly designated as the target. The goal, of course, is to correctly identify the target clip from amongst the 3 decoy clips. As Chris so ably explained yesterday, the expected mean chance expectation is that one, by chance alone, should guess the right target 25% of the time. So in Ganzfeld's work, where typically these days 4 different potential targets make up the target pack for any session, you would hope for a significant deviation from the 25% hit rate. Now, to tell you more about the Ganzfeld method very quickly, a participant is confronted or given, they're lying back in a comfortable chair. They're wearing headphones, which will first give them usually a relaxation exercise. The headphones will then convey white noise, and they are looking at a homogeneous visual field. The idea is to create a homogeneous, relaxing environment whereby the participant can concentrate on internal imagery and things that they don't usually attend to. And the environment may even help create a stimulus hunger that will turn their attention inwardly, so to speak. And that's it in a very big nutshell. I'm sure Adrian would have more to say from it than that. But here's a picture of someone in the Ganzfeld getting the homogeneous visual field. They're making the imitation. I see the color yellow. Here are the 4 target choices. And as you can see, there is certainly yellow in at least one of them. Now, the Ganzfeld was a great success. The Maimonides dream research, as you heard yesterday from Chris, and if you want more information about it, read Simon Sherwood and his excellent review of the dream research that was published in 2003 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. But it was, in some respects, a way of creating a more user-friendly and experimenter-friendly way of testing for psi using an altered state of consciousness that was related to the sleep state. In other words, that we're looking to find a way to elicit the type of information that was coming from dream research, where you didn't need a participant to come into a sleep lab, spend the night wired up, an insomniac experimenter to be waking them every time their REM got to the right state, and so on. So it was viewed as a more user-friendly, both for the participant and the experimenter, way of potentially getting into that state. There was a lot of experiments done using the Ganzfeld after Adrian, Chuck Honorton's and William Broad's initial study. And at this conference in 1982 at Cambridge, there was the first presentation of a meta-analysis of the work by Chuck Honorton, where he was saying the studies so far are showing a good hit rate. I think it was 33% hit rate against 25% of chance. However, at that conference, there was also a critic who stood up, Ray Hyman, and said, no, it could all be down to possible flaws. I will spare you the long debate that took part after that, involved many others, but to make a long story short, in 1985, Chuck Honorton and Ray Hyman issued a joint communique where they made a list of recommendations of what people should do when they're doing Ganzfeld work to avoid the controversy. So, after that, people did adopt it, and there's a new set of Ganzfeld studies starting in 1987, and that same basic design is still generally used today. Now, the Ganzfeld method, I should say, has traditionally used a telepathic design, where a sender is viewing the target and trying to mentally convey it to the person who is receiving the Ganzfeld stimulation and generating the impressions. In rarer precognition studies using the Ganzfeld, there is no sender, and the judging actually occurs before a target has been randomly chosen. In other words, it's a basic precognition study. As I say, there's a new generation of Ganzfeld studies starting in 1987. These have had several different meta-analyses done looking at the efficacy of the database. There you see the pictures from right to left of Julie Milton and of Richard Wiseman, who did a critical review. I should say that the first review in 1994 was by Ben and Honorton in the Psychological Bulletin. Then there were 2 more reviews of the more advanced database. In 1999, the Milton Wiseman, and then in 2010, one by Storm, Trisoli, and Dorizio. And by this time, the database consisted of 60 of the more advanced new generation Ganzfeld studies. Okay, what were these studies finding overall? The white line is mean chance expectation, and what you will see here is a large array of studies and how well they did according to hit rate. If you go out to the far end of the screen, you'll see that the more recent studies are showing a more coherent hitting pattern, and the earlier studies look a bit more divergent. Nonetheless, there is a overall effect size.
What? See it. There's nothing on the screen.
I think you might need to click again, Deborah.
Oh,
click again.
I'm sorry. Thank you. There you can see the general spread of the hit rate of the experiments. Again, the more recent ones at the far left side are showing a more coherent hitting pattern, and the earlier ones are looking quite divergent. Nonetheless, while there's a lot of heterogeneity in the database, for the statistically minded, there is an overall Z-score from these studies of 5.29, which is a very significant effect. P is less than 0.0001. The effect size is 0.09. So, moving onward from these findings, Storm, Trezzoli, and Doricio concluded that 34 years of Ganzfeld research has produced a communications anomaly worth investigating further. A lot of work has been done trying to look at how we can maximize the effect in the Ganzfeld. And there have been some clues from the database. First off, in the Storm et al. Study, they discovered that one way of creating more homogeneity in the database was to divide the studies by those that used selected subjects and those who did not use selected subjects. They found 14 studies had used selected subjects, and these 14 studies had an overall hit rate on average of 40.1%. Again, only 25 expected by chance. The effect size was a goodly 0.26. If they looked at unselected subjects, the hit rate when you're just taking in your normal psychology student or a person off the street who you convinced to come in and be your participant in a session, the hit rate falls to 27.3 with an effect size of 0.05. There is a significant difference between the effect sizes of these two studies at the 0.002 level. So it looks like that is a effect that would be followed up on. In fact, if one wanted to boost your average strength in your Ganzfeld study, they would say that you should use exclusively selected participants. But what is meant by selected participants? Here, in this study and in most others, they are selecting them on one or more of the following criteria. First off, that the participant will have practiced a mental discipline, such as meditation or relaxation, that they will have a prior belief in psi and or experience of ESP or PK, that they will have an artistic or creative ability. At least they'll self-report that they do so. Another possible way of selecting them is people who've gone through a site training procedure, which is something that we did a lot of work with in Edinburgh in the 1980s and 90s. Also, that they will have previous experience of psi experimentation. I should note that normally you're not invited back to do more studies unless you've enjoyed it and done well. So you're probably self-selecting there from participants who have been previously successful to some degree. Now, as I said, almost all of the studies have been using a telepathy model, not a precognition model. Why is this? We go back to Chuck Honorton, one of the three founders or initial users of the Ganzfeld technique. And this is a picture of Chuck Honorton and Don McCarthy. Don has his hand on Chuck's shoulder. And Don reported that he, i.e. Chuck told me that in designing the Ganzfeld procedure, a primary reason for choosing a telepathy protocol was that it might lead to more ready acceptance, since people seemed less threatened by the idea of a mental radio. Here, harking back to Upton Sinclair's book, The Mental Radio, that was published in the 1930s. But there have been some precognition studies before this one, 7 in total. They have all, except for one, obtained significant overall results. The one that didn't, by Rogo, was still in the psi-hitting direction with an overall p-value of 0.07. 3 of the studies, most recent studies, were done by Rowe, Callum Cooper, who we've just heard reporting, and other Northampton people. Now, as you can see, the average hit rate of the later studies is averaging in the low 40s. Again, it's a much higher hit rate than you would expect by chance alone, with a few exceptions, but 135%, but nonetheless, 43.7, 35%, 41%, 40%, 43%. That's a nice hit rate that we would all like to have in our Ganzfeld studies, or at least I would have loved to have had in mine. There are other advantages for using a precognitive design. First off, you have greatly improved security, because when people are generating their impressions before the target has been created and chosen, when they are doing the judging before a target has been chosen, it's very hard to cheat. And that becomes increasingly something we have to be concerned about in these days of ubiquitous handheld phones and other such things, where people can easily skirt around many precautions you might put in place. Also, it requires fewer resources. You don't need a sender. You don't need an experimenter to monitor the sender. You don't need a sender's room, and you don't need to synchronize the sender and receiver activities, all of which can be of a bit of bother to work out when you're designing a study. Now, it has long been assumed that one of the reasons the Ganzfeld was so successful was because it created an altered state in the participant, a hypnagogic state, if you will. However, Rowe in 2009 said that the evidence for this was actually rather meager. We don't know if they're actually achieving a hypnagogic state. Similarly, Wackerman, a few years earlier, had noted that there were a very wide number of differences in the way that individuals would respond to the Ganzfeld stimulation. So a question here is the people who habituate to the Ganzfeld stimulation more readily, who achieve apparently a greater altered state of consciousness, are they doing better? Are they performing better at identifying the target in a Ganzfeld trial than those that don't? But that means that you have to find a way of measuring the degree of altered state of consciousness that a participant has when they're in the Ganzfeld. To measure that, Caroline and her colleagues adopted 2 methodologies. First off, they used the 12 dimensions found in the Phenomenology of Consciousness Inventory, or the PCI. They also looked at participants' estimate of how long the session took, because it's well known that the more altered your state of consciousness, the more time seems to expand. So you think you were actually in it for a much shorter time than you actually were. Study method. Participants were selected in accordance with their beliefs in psi, their experience of psi, their artistic ability, and whether they practiced a mental discipline, not necessarily all 3 together, but at least one of those. The 3 separate experimenters each conducted 20 trials, and there was a considerable effort made, as most of us do, to create a psi-conducive environment, make sure the participants were feeling relaxed, knew exactly what was expected of them, were happy and feeling well looked at before they went in and actually underwent the Ganzfeld stimulation. The stimulation itself, first off, they were in a reclining, comfortable chair. They went through 10 minutes of a progressive relaxation exercise, and then 25 minutes of the Ganzfeld stimulation, the white noise and the red homogeneous visual field. After the impressions were generated, and I should say they say their impressions out loud as they occur to them. They are recorded electronically, and they are also recorded by an experimenter who is with the participant monitoring them during the session. As soon as the impression period is over, they completed the time estimation scale, and they then took the phenomenology of consciousness inventory and completed that. Then they were shown the target pack, which consisted of 4 video clips chosen to be orthogonal from each other, and they reviewed their mentations to see how they related to the potential targets. They then chose what they thought the target would be. After that had all been registered and entered electronically and time-stamped, then the computer actually randomly chose which would be the target for that session. Hence the precognitive nature. The hypotheses were that there would be overall significant hitting on the precognition task, measured by the exact binomial, and regarding the altered state of consciousness inside, that there would be a negative correlation between time estimate and success on the task. In other words, those that were more successful would think the session was shorter than those who were not so successful. Also, that there would be a positive correlation between the PCI scores, in other words, a greater altered state of consciousness, and the side task performance measure. So, what did she find? First off, a nice significant overall degree of psi hitting. 15 direct hits would have been expected by chance alone. She obtained, or the study obtained 22. The hit rate overall was 36.7. Again, MCE is just 25, and it is a significant outcome for the study. Now, regarding the measures relating the success to the altered states of consciousness, first off, there was no significant correlation between time estimation and side task performance. In other words, the more successful sessions did not think that time was slowing down as opposed to the less successful sessions, as it had been hypothesized they would. Nor was there any correlation between the 12 PCI scores, which measure how much of an ASC one actually is experiencing, and again, side task performance. So this is really throwing into question the degree to which altered states of consciousness is an important aspect of Ganzfeld performance. Certainly it doesn't appear to have been so in this study. Conclusion. How am I doing for time? Almost right. Here they had Caroline thinks that the precognitive design is a very good one. It gives you added security, and this particular study is adding to the already fairly small but impressive results found in other precognitive Ganzfeld studies. And it offers greater security and less use of resources than a normal mental telepathy form of Ganzfeld. However, she does think that more studies need to be done to validate this. And not long ago, I think I have time to touch on this briefly, Dick Bierman and some of his colleagues proposed the idea in 2016, I think it was, that questionable research practices, or QRPs, could account for some of the Ganzfeld success. They made it clear the database was still significant after you had taken QRPs into account. But Caroline and Jim Kennedy sat down and got together and thought, why don't we devise something that will eliminate that as a possible concern? So what they've done is they've set up what they're calling is a prospective meta-analysis, where before you run your Ganzfeld study, be it telepathy or precognition, you go onto a website at the Kersler Chair, and you'll find it all laid out there if you go there, and you register all the details of the study before you actually run it. This is not a new idea in parapsychology. Many of us have listed our procedures with colleagues to make sure we're not fudging it for decades, In fact, the EJP used to accept papers for publication based on the proposed methodology before the study was even conducted. But nonetheless, this is a database that you can register your study with before it's run. It will eliminate any possibility of QRP, questionable research practices. This is the first study that's being listed on it. And anyone who is thinking of doing a Ganzfeld study, I'm sure Caroline would like to encourage you to use the database. And I think that's all we have at the moment. Again, she goes back to don't give up on this baby. It is a technique that is still producing good results, and we still have probably a fair bit to learn from it. So I thank you very much for your kind attention.